Good morning, good afternoon, whatever you are in the world. It is another great day where we discuss a topic, my favorite topic, and that of culture. My name is Mona with Mona Lou International, the American Institute of Global Protocol and Culture. What do we do in this show? And whatever, on everything that we do is bridge the culture gap. And today I have a special guest that will speak about her experience and what she observes. Hopefully, it can be of a benefit to someone that is attending this show or will be listening to us later on. We do know that there are over 200 nations and states, and every nation has its own culture, its national culture. It is a set of values and beliefs and attitudes that can be studied, that can be observed, and also can be translated, can be predicted somehow as far as behavior, as far as results. And our role is to get you as close as possible to those cultures for better business and also to minimize from misunderstanding. As you know, a lot of issues, a lot of challenges, a lot of problems arise from not understanding, from misunderstanding and not knowing what an action is, what an action means, what is it equivalent to in your local culture. Without any delay, I am pleased and delighted to introduce our guest. She will tell us more about herself. I know her name is Kristen, and she is from North Carolina, and she is in the medical field. Kristen, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Mona. A little bit about me. I had a pretty typical upbringing in America, you know, softball in the summer, school during the year, soccer in the fall and spring. I was part of that generation that grew up with, 9/11 in the Iraq War. So, there was a lot of propaganda coming in when I was growing up. But I grew up, I work in the medical field now, and, culture is really, really special to me too. My husband is Egyptian, therefore half my family is Egyptian. But above that, in medicine, if you don't understand culture well, it can really, really impact how well you work or don't work with your patients. I think a great example of that is my experience working in the pandemic. You're on COVID units, you have limited access to the outside world and resources sometimes. There were some Arab patients who, were very confused. We were trying to use interpreters and translators to work with them, but it wasn't real helpful because even the interpreter said, hey, this person's too confused, I can't communicate with them. So there was one case where a guy just was not eating no matter what they did. And I went in, worked with him, looked at his tray, and just understanding, Arab culture, hey, there's bacon on the plate, there's sausage, he's not going to touch it. We were able to solve a lot of problems there. So very, very important when you're working with people and in medicine in general.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing that. I will go back to a little bit of your upbringing and like you mentioned, the propaganda and all the noises that you receive from the outside can hinder your understanding of what the world is about. And if we're not smart enough or we're not intelligent enough and wanting to know and find out for ourselves, we'll be really taken for a ride. Yes. In the midst of all the bumps that lead us to making or creating this view in our mind about a certain people, as we call it, a profiling a person or a culture or a country based on what we hear, but not based on what we experience. And that is very important. One thing that you mentioned, you grew up during the 9/11, a lot of things coming into you, not so much sure about your feelings. And then here you are, you met this Arab person, this Arab man that eventually became your husband, I believe. And congratulations. Yes. I hope things are going well. And
very well.
Then you're finding out that whatever you were told, whatever things that were programmed into your mind were not really true. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience from having this picture of a culture, and then once you get into it and you experience it, you're finding out that whatever you were told was not true. It is a quite different story.
Sure, absolutely. Again, kind of growing up in the 9/11 and Iraq War eras, here in the States, we were absolutely bombarded by, oh, these people are so oppressed. Oh, look, weapons of mass destruction. It was more focusing on events and all the bad things, not the people and individual people and their culture itself. One big thing we have here in the States is there's a lot of propaganda through movies and TV, right? So movies and TV, who's the bad guy? The Arab, right? Who's always oppressed by the bad guys, Arab woman being forced to do this, to do that. And, it really is a very sneaky way of influencing your thinking. Even today, when I talk to other people who haven't had my same experience with Arab people and culture, they kind of assume that every single Arab country is for example, Afghanistan under the Taliban right now. I'm just like, no, and have to re-educate. But coming back to myself, I managed to break through a little bit of that propaganda saying there's no way all this is one way. It can't all be true. But otherwise, I was kind of the, don't know much, but hey, free Palestine, whatever that means, sort of typical American until I met my husband. And, it's been a really slow burn. We've been married for almost 8 years now. But it's kind of that cycle, you talk, you learn a little bit, you go, wait, what? Really? You let it process and then you learn more. I think a really good example of this, actually, a couple really good examples would be, for example, I didn't know that there was a major conflict between Egypt and Israel in the 1960s until my husband told me. And when he first told me this, I was like, no, is it April Fool's? Are you kidding me? We hear nothing about this at all. But then you learn more, you watch documentaries, you watch Arab movies, so on and so forth. And you're like, wow. Another big example, and there's a film that I really like made by an Arab director. It's based on, I believe it's called the Nakba, the calamity in Palestine after World War II. But it's the story of a girl whose father hid her in a closet, basically like a food pantry, when the Israelis were invading Palestine from the first place. And that was a really powerful experience for me. I had to watch it in about 10 or 15 minutes intervals because it's just so sad and so horrific. But, people went through it. I can watch it. You watch, you learn, you read more, you listen more, and you just say, wow, eventually it gets to the point you think you grew up in an alternate reality almost. It's quite incredible.
Yeah. And it just it changes your whole outlook on any topic and any situation and geopolitical issues that we sometimes don't hear about in our news outlet. Going back to Arab, I just want to point out to the listeners that when we are talking about Arabs, there are actually 3 kinds of Arabs. And we will explain those in details in another episode. But as far as Egyptian is a country where majority of people speak Arabic, and they're Muslims, they're Christians, and also they're Jews, and they're people from all faiths. So when we talk about the example, if we go back to your example, as far as, okay, these people are not eating, it's not so much an Arab culture, but it is an Islamic tradition of not eating pork. So we have to be mindful, we have to be aware when we are talking about Arabs that, first of all, there are 3 kinds of Arabs. There some countries were Arabized, some others originally Arabs, and others who are mixed of all kinds of people. So when you're dealing with particular cultures such as Egypt, and that's the encounter you've had, we have to treat it as a single entity, which may have some influence of Arab culture, but it has its own particular national culture that when we're dealing with Egyptians, we have to understand the norms and the traditions and values, and we have to identify, are we dealing with a Muslim Egyptian, or are we dealing with Christian Egyptian, or are we dealing with a Jew Egyptian, or other faith. So that has to be really identified. But overall, we just have to understand the national culture, and then we can dive in a little bit further into the person that we're dealing with. So Kristen, what can you tell people today? Because I know you're passionate about this subject. I know culture is a big thing in your life, and you realize how important it is. Sometimes we overlook the importance of culture, and then we realize that we are a product of culture. Each one of us is a product of culture. And if we don't understand that part very well, then all kind of misunderstanding can arise, and that is not good for our health, that is not good for our personal social relationship, and not good for business as well. So today, when you see, for example, on the news, on social media, on the outside world, when you hear these things about a culture that you came so close to, and that is an Egyptian culture, that is Arab culture, where a majority speak Arabic, and also they have some Arab culture in Egypt that is influential or influence all part of their life. What do you tell people?
So I've had some pretty interesting conversations on that front. Sometimes, as you said, I'm very passionate about this subject, and I'll be talking to patients saying, hey, my family's Egyptian, such and such and such. And of course, those stereotypes come up. Oh, why would you go there? Because of how they treat women. I really do a lot of gentle re-educating on that front. I'll use videos of my cute little nieces and nephews to just break the ice and say, hey, kids here, kids there, very similar, and then kind of go from there, talking about bigger subjects. One thing that I do too is if someone's really aggressively trying to convince me something about Arab countries and cultures that is just not true, I flat out ask them, where did you hear this and how do you know it? Like you've mentioned, there is so much in our heads that is just there. It's put there. We don't know it. We think it's our own thoughts. But when you look into it, you say, where did this come from and how did I learn it? And I think identifying those hot topics or those hot thoughts is really, really key. One thing that I really like to do with people who just push back against me is kind of gently nudge them towards, let's look for the sameness here versus the otherness. For example, I'll come back to my nieces and nephews. How can you say no to a 3-year-old doing a cute little toddler dance, right? Like, how can you hate that? So once you break that bridge, you can really start to challenge them on thoughts they have in their head that are not necessarily theirs. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, well, I know that so much of what you do is obviously you were bumping up in a culture that is telling you this is the way it is. Then you found out that whatever I was told is not true. And now you're trying to educate people every time you encounter a conversation or you come across a situation where there is a lot of stereotyping about this particular region. And this particular region is so rich in cultures. It has so many variances and differences that people have to understand. Listen, Afghanistan is not an Arab, okay? Afghanistan is not Arab. Pakistan is not Arab. There's so many confusions and so many stereotypes that people don't pay so much attention to, and they're so caught up in that noise, the programming that happened since they were little. And what we do in our programs and our teaching, our education, our courses is basically to point out that whatever you were told may not be correct 100%. And this is why there are models, there are systems of understanding culture, because cultures are social behaviors from thousands and thousands of years that are brought down to generations and generations. So with that being said, if we take a look at each culture, we can understand, why do they do what they do? Why do they believe what they believe? Why do they think what they think? Why do they value what they value? And when we understand that, things become easier. We start to relate so much to them. And if we don't understand what they are, then of course the stereotype will be there, the misunderstanding will be there, and the judgment will be there, the never-ending judgment. And that's what we do. And I do appreciate your time. I appreciate what you do outside of your medical field, and also now that you are aware of culture, of the impact of culture, your job is much better.
Absolutely. I actually have one more interesting story on the kind of note of stereotyping for you that you may appreciate. But it was a very, very strange event. Like, I'm still kind of partly shocked that this person was so aggressive, because it was a professional setting in the middle of the hospital. I was actually at the nurse's station with a student of mine, just showing her pictures of my family and like my husband's trip to the pyramids, and again, my cute little nieces and nephews and everything. And this doctor was just sitting nearby doing her own note, and suddenly just cuts in and gets in my face, literally, oh, Egypt, blah, 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 blah. Egypt does this, Egypt does that. Did you know how much they treat like camels at the pyramids? And just this never ending rant. So I'm like, I'm going from hanging out with my student, having fun, to suddenly being on my heels on the defensive, right? So, whoa. So not only do you have to re-educate, you also have to diffuse. But she just kept going. The only way I could diffuse is just basically saying, hey, look, one, half my family is Egyptian. Do you have something to say to me? Which made her back down. I hate to meet fire with fire, but it was necessary in that situation. But from there, we were able to discuss a little bit of, sure, there probably are these problems in Egypt. I'm sure they exist, but look here in the States too. We have just as many problems with animal abuse, with abuse of humans, so on and so forth. It's very interesting. In US propaganda, they have quite the skill for picking out little things that we have here in spades, but magnifying it in other countries to feed into that propaganda and really getting you think negatively about that. So I would challenge anybody who hears something bad about Arab people, Arab culture, Arab countries, hold that thought, do your research and say, do we have it here? If so, is it something I've been worried about? Is it something that I've challenged here in my own country too? It's just a thought. It's an interesting game to play with yourself as well.
Yeah. And it's just not only the Arab culture, any culture in this world. Like, for example, I was in England not long ago, as a matter of fact, earlier this month. And when I asked in English people about Americans, they have their own say. And I tell them, some of the stuff that you're saying may be true, but others are not. And you have to understand why are they loud? For example, something like that. Well, the Americans are so loud. Yes. They're so unsophisticated as far as culture. But yes, we have these observations about people, but sometimes we don't understand, why did we form that opinion about a certain people? And once we sit down and understand and have a dialogue, then you find out, well, that behavior, I can understand. I relate to that behavior, and it's perfectly fine. If that works for them, who am I to tell people what they need to do? Who am I to tell people? All I can do is just understand, learn, appreciate, and if there's something that I see that I am not in agreement with, then let's carry on. I mean, there's not much you can do, and you cannot impose your ideas, you cannot impose your habits, you cannot impose anything on anyone, but rather understand, appreciate, and respect. Like I said, we all the same, but we just do things differently. And that's where the golden egg is at, because we have to find or find out about those differences to make it enjoyable experience with anyone that we come across with. Any final thoughts, Kristen? I know you are in your office. Any final thought before we say goodbye?
Sure. One final thought that I would really encourage people to do is, if there's a culture where you're like, wow, I don't know much about this, I'd like to learn more. How can I relate to them? Is learn the language, right? I've been learning Egyptian Arabic for a little over a year now. I'm somewhat conversational, not fluent yet, but that's coming. I'm not giving up. But just the way people phrase things, you can learn so much about a culture by the way the language is set up. For example, some people just don't understand how Egyptians like connect ideas, or they might say they're weird the way they think about things, right? But once you delve into the language and say, oh, Arabic's actually a very poetic, very strong and emotional language, that's why people communicate the way they do, it can really help you understand somebody better. So yes, it's hard. Yes, it's difficult. Yes, it's frustrating, but learning a language by itself, if nothing else, can really teach you a lot about a people and their culture as well. So if you have time, it's worth a shot.
Well, thank you for mentioning that. One thing before I let you go, because it's funny that you said understanding the language, and sometimes even at the beginning you mentioned about translation, and we do know that there are some words. I mean, the Arabic itself is a rich language, eloquent language with over 23,000 words, or so, if I'm not mistaken. And there are words which do not have translations in English. How do you do that? I mean, how can, so often we said, okay, well, here's this text in Arabic translated in English, or here's a patient I have, you're just translating what I'm saying in English in Arabic into English, and sometimes the words don't have equivalent in English. I mean, how do you deal with that?
I'm dealing with that right now. Actually, I have a patient from Palestine. Yes, I get into everything, Mona. I'm dealing with a patient from Palestine who her English is okay, but not quite there. And my Arabic is okay, but not quite there. So we mix it up and we use what I call Arablish. And really, in those cases, it comes to the basics, just keep it simple. And it's okay to say, hey, I don't know. It's okay to whip out Google Translate if you're really stuck. But you're right, it is a challenge. I have found that in the end, most people appreciate you trying, especially languages most people don't learn here. So, yeah, but it is a struggle, yes.
Well, I highly salute you and commend you for what you do, because being aware of our own culture in itself is a huge challenge, because so often we ask people about their cultures and they don't know their own, let alone going out there and challenging themselves and learning about other culture. That is such a beautiful thing to do, and this is what we're all here, what we're all about and here to do, getting to know one another, because whatever we learn from another person can help us now and in the future, and can help us grow, and taking that time to understand about others is a really, really noble action and noble cause. So I highly recommend people to open up their heart, open up their mind, and be willing to learn, be willing to accept, be willing to understand. So I do thank you so very much for your time. I know you're very busy, and if there is anything that you'd like to discuss with people in the future, by all means, come back again and tell us about your stories, and tell us about the effect of culture and how it impacts your daily life, whether at your medical facility or in your personal social life as well.
All right, sounds great. Thank you for having me today, Mona.
Thank you so very much.